Our first speaker is the chairman of the board for the SIP Forum, Richard Shockey.
I've been driving all night, my hands wet on the wheel. There's a voice in my head that drives my heel.
Well, are you awake yet? I'm sure there's still coffee available here one way or the other. However, let me start out by thanking Genban and the entire marketing team, for a fabulous couple of days here one way or the other. I want to, a round of applause, folks. Absolutely super job by everybody concerned. So what I want to talk about today is accelerating the IP transition, or what I refer to as the good, the bad, and the ugly that is really out there one way or the other. And so to really start out, not all of you are necessarily familiar with what the SIP Forum is, and we're sort of a technical promotion board for the session initiation protocol. And for those of you obviously know what SIP is, it's the basis for all IP real-time communications in the modern network. So we have a number of both service providers as well as equipment suppliers, including the generous support of Genban here, who lets us do lots of things, such as provide interoperability testing forums. We do various profiles for the industry on how SIP works in the network, and I'll have some more information about that a little bit later. But we do appreciate all of your support for the SIP Forum going forward. So I always like to begin a talk with the number one takeaway, which is something I call Shockey's Law, which is no matter what we're talking about, anytime, any place to a certain extent, it's really going to be about money in some way, shape, or form. And the issues that we've got to deal with in the IP transition surround or involve money in some way, shape, or form. So we'll talk about this as we sort of move forward here, but it's extremely important. The transition that we're going through right now is pretty profound, but this has been telecommunications, frankly, forever. We've gone through racks of clicking machines, one way or other, to digital. Now we're moving in part to landline, to wireless, one way or other, and this has been a fairly profound transformation of the industry in a variety of ways. But we are making progress, and we will continue to do so. So let's talk about the good news. And Clint Eastwood is usually a pretty good way to start out with that. I really want to pick up on something David mentioned yesterday, which is, I think, another key takeaway from my little talk this morning, which is protect what you have. It's really important to understand that if you're a service provider providing a triple play or a rural carrier or a cable operator, that we protect the revenue streams that are already out there. And let's not forget that basically voice communications is a really good business. Money is the answer. What is the question? It's really hard to get good figures about exactly what voice provides the industry in terms of revenue, but I've done some back-of-the-envelope calculations, and I generally think that real-time communications for service providers is about a $140 billion a year business in the United States alone. And as I'm from Northern Virginia outside of Washington, D.C., and as we say all the time in Washington, a billion here, a billion there, it suddenly adds up to real money after a while. So protecting what we have right now, which is $140 billion in industry revenue, is probably a good business model to continue on a forward-looking basis. But we're at a tipping point. Right now, if you look at all the access platforms, wireless, the cable operators have been all IP for years. You look at Verizon Fios, AT&T UVerse, and certainly enterprise communications. The Federal Communication Commission estimates that about 30% of all real-time communications right now today is actually all IP-based. But this tipping point is literally at our doorstep. The wireless operators are going to be converting to voice over LTE slowly but deliberately over the next 36 months or so. And that means all IP end-to-end communications will be about 75% of the market. And I've been talking to service providers, over the last 2 years, and one of the things that we want to do, which we believe is going to be the next profitable service, is really point-to-point video calling over really the public switch network. And we can do that now. And all IP interconnection is beginning, but it still needs some work associated with it. One of the things I also want to point out is don't worry about OTT. I know everybody says, well, you've got to have a strategy for OTT. But what my analysis has demonstrated generally is that fragmentation. OTT is about fragmenting the marketplace, whether it be Skype or all of these various instant messaging services one way or the other. Fragmentation is the friend of regulated carriers. What the public switch network has always been able to provide consumers is an any-to-any model of real-time communications, and that still has value. People pay good money for that. They pay for quality of service, they pay for a quality of experience, and whether it be $14.95 a month or $19.95 a month, that's really good money for this industry, and we should continue to try and protect it. I absolutely positively reject the notion that somehow Facebook is going to be the new phone company. Anybody who tells you that Facebook is the new phone company, ask them what they are smoking and why they are not sharing. I mean, seriously, how purple is your Kool-Aid? One of the things that I do point out is the history of instant messaging. I have enough gray hair, obviously, where I've seen whether it be AOL instant messaging, Hotmail instant messaging, and none of them ever work with each other. And frankly, all of those instant messaging services, Yahoo instant messaging, they're all dead right now. What won? The lowly SMS service using E164 naming and addressing. So hello, folks. Basically, real-time communications from anyone to anyone, anywhere on planet Earth, still has a lot of value here. And one of the things that we're trying to do in the SIP forum is we have been working with our partners ATIS, the Alliance for Telecommunications Industry Solutions, on an all-IP profile for IP interconnection among service providers. Over 120 engineers have been working on this profile for the last 18 months. It has been led by AT&T. It has been led by Comcast, along with my good friend John Barnhill here of GenBand. We are done. We are going to publish this profile literally within the next 30 days. I can sort of announce it here for all of you bloggers. And it will be available to the entire industry free of charge. No pay to play. You can download it. You can talk to your vendors. You can talk to your engineering teams about how to implement this. We looked at this in two ways. One is an on-the-wire protocol, namely how does SIP work from Cox Communication to Verizon? What is the SIP signaling and SIP messaging that goes back and forth? That is now well documented. Also, we have tried to document how the traditional telephony numbering databases should be utilized in a transition environment. This would be the LERG, the Local Exchange Routing Guide, which all of you know and probably detest in one way, shape, or form. And now also the Number Portability Database Administration, the NPAD. We have some guidelines. We did not have consensus on how this would work, but we have documentation that you can use for planning purposes on how this new transition will work. So we are, in fact, getting there. Now the bad news. I have spent a lot of time talking to regulators at the Federal Communications Commission, the CRTC in Ottawa, Canada, Ofcom in the United Kingdom, one way or the other. And if there's one thing that they are furious about is this business of caller ID spoofing and robocalls. It is the #1 complaint to the Federal Trade Commission. It is the #1 complaint to the CRTC in Ottawa, Canada, and actually it's the #1 issue for Consumers Union in the United States, and every single solitary one of us have experienced it. You know, the infamous phone call from Rachel of Card Member Services at 6 o'clock when you're, or 7 o'clock when you're trying to have dinner, or the pizza just showed up at your front door. This has got to stop. And the regulators are going to slowly but surely make clear that if we as an industry don't fix it, they're going to end up fixing us in some way, shape, or form. So we have been having discussions on a tactical basis to actually put together public key infrastructure to sign the SIP signaling using public keys and private keys for the entire North American numbering plan, which is about 800 million telephone numbers. Session border controllers would probably be the point of origins to both create the signaling validation as well as decode the encrypted hash tables and stuff like that. The IETF and STIR is working on this right now. It's going to take time, but frankly, it is now ultimately inevitable. The other issue that the regulators that I talk to have been concerned about is it is very difficult for consumers to authenticate where the call is coming from. And this, frankly, all of you know CNAM, of course, which is really a lousy service. It's 15 characters worth of ASCII. We have all of these wonderful mobile devices. We have rich multimedia displays. We have a big television set, which is potentially a phone as well. We need to look at how to recreate the CNAM service for consumers. And frankly, this is a good business as well. It was a good business for carriers in the past. We think it can be a good business for carriers in the future. And frankly, video calling, which I think is an important product for all of us, I think is going to be dependent upon this on a forward-looking basis. So there are tactical initiatives that we can all begin to work on that can make things better and frankly that can be profitable at the same time. The other big issues that tend to come up in terms of inter-carrier relationships is as we go through this transition, guess what? No more tandems. Our friends from Verizon were talking about yesterday that they're consolidating their rate centers into only a simple number of geographic areas. The number I've heard bandying about is somewhere between 7 and 12. Namely, every single solitary call that ingresses or egresses a major incumbent carrier's network would only be done at maybe 7 to 12 locations in the United States. There's one well-known cable operator in the United States that only uses 4. And then all of those central offices can be sold off for data centers and other purposes, much like our colleague from Verizon talked about yesterday. Some of us actually want to restructure numbering, naming, and addressing in the U.S. If there's no more rate centers, what do we care about the geographic nature of phone numbers? There is no technical reason we cannot have national geographic number portability to the point where you get a phone number from a service provider and you can keep it essentially for the rest of your natural life. Namely, our phone numbers sort of like domain names in one way, shape, or form. These are ideas that are beginning to be kicked around, and can we build new products and new services based on E164 naming and addressing? So this is now coming up. The ugly. That is obviously Chairman Tom Wheeler of the Federal Communications Commission. Regulatory is with us, just like death and taxes. We have no way of getting around with it. There are several food fights out there. The one I actually want to point out to you while I still have a little bit of time is content is the new net neutrality. The biggest single threat to our industry is right here in Orlando, Florida. As a matter of fact, we were standing last night at the biggest single solitary threat to our industry, which is the Walt Disney Company. And the reason for this is content fees. For those of you who are providing residential triple plays, the fee structure is just completely out of control. I spoke to rural carriers not that long ago, and they're being quoted $10.20 per sub per month just for the ESPN channel. Money is the answer. What is the question here? I do not think this is sustainable, but we need to look at what's happening in Canada. I think our Canadian friends have done all of us a great service because they have mandated both retail as well as wholesale a la carte, which means that you can pick channels that you want and not pick channels that you don't want. And frankly, I'm not a big fan of ESPN. The reason for that is I live in Washington, D.C., and we do not have a football team. You can say what you want about the Washington Redskins, but they are not a football team. And personally, I believe giving Snyder one single red cent is a sin. I'm sure some of you who live in the metropolitan Philadelphia area have similar feelings about the Eagles and stuff like that. But remember Verizon. They decided to have a skinny Fios package, and what was the first thing that happened to Verizon? The Walt Disney Company sued them. And our friends at Cablevision have had a long suit with Viacom under antitrust law, basically saying that these bundles and these packages are basically, sucking the oxygen out of the profitability of our industry. And those are progressing. And we will see how they work in the future. The other is grandma's phone. Now, what does grandma's phone mean? The most powerful lobby in Washington, D.C. is the American Association of Retired Persons, AARP. Forget the NRA. The gun guys, they're good, but they're not even close to the power that AARP has. And a lot of us have had an existential fear that in the IP transition, somebody is going to accuse our industry of taking away grandma's phone, and then all hell will break loose. So it is something to watch. We've already heard this kind of rhetoric going back and forth in Washington from one way or the other. I could say something about 251 SIP interconnection, but time is getting short. By the way, for those of you who are rural carriers, yes, there will be Connect America Fund reform. Yes, Virginia, they will tax the internet. Supporting rural broadband is important. We've been only doing it for 80 years or something else like that. So this is something that we all need to consider. It is going to be a big food fight, but it's important for all of us to get behind some reasonable reform on this. So. Since John Malone, of course, has been in the news recently one way or the other, let's not forget that if all you have to worry about is regulation, you're probably in a pretty good business here. Speaking of net neutrality, now what? We all know basically what has been going on in Washington with this. The idea was that broadband would be reclassified as a common carrier service under Title II. The real issue was always price control. Would the government suddenly have authority to regulate prices for residential and mobile broadband services? As it stands now, they sort of do. More importantly, would the Federal Communications Commission be able to regulate the transit peering agreements by which service providers exchange their IP traffic? And that is in fact something that they are now authorized to do, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not a particularly good idea, by the way, in my judgment. We will see. Those rules now potentially kick in on June the 12th, and every carrier in in the United States is suing the FCC in one way, shape, or form, trying to get injunctive relief and a potential stay of the order. We shall see what happens. But of course, some service providers, being cynics, like me, for instance, think, well, you know, if we can just delay this in the courts for 18 months or so until after November 2016, maybe we'll sort of see what happens here. So that's, in fact, something to watch here one way or the other. If we are going to see price controls, could we get price controls on telecom lawyers? That would be nice. I mean, that's change even I could believe in to a certain extent. So these are still on the table, still important, and could make the IP transition even more difficult than it already is. I don't want to preach about Washington, but there's this famous saying, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So we all have to watch these things relatively closely. So I'm getting short on time, and I don't want to be accused of running over. So a few words of wisdom here, again, from Washington. Our president has a policy theme on a forward-looking basis, or otherwise known as, someone asked him, do you have a bucket list? And he said, well, I have something that rhymes with bucket. So we shall see what happens there. And last but not least, the most famous line in Washington, D.C. is related to Shockey's law, which is follow the money. So that is all I have in the time that I'm allotted. Thank you very much for your attention, and see you later.